You don't have to look through too much of our history as a species to see how different things have been in the past, whether it's 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. There are so many elements of everybody's day to day lives across all different parts of the planet in all different types of history, where what you would spend your time doing, what you needed to do to live, how you would interact with others, and how you would even just perceive of the world around you would be so radically different from today that it's kind of hard to fully empathize with and understand. As these shifts occur in different places at different times, they're often not intentional and often the result of just small technological shifts or small cultural shifts that end up playing out over time to become something much larger and radical. And it only makes sense that as there are more people alive now than there ever have been before, and as we're all richer and more productive and inventing more things and experimenting with more lifestyles than ever before, that we would be at a time of many such shifts. And these sorts of changes are a big theme of what I like to explore in the podcast, mainly because it's interesting to me. But I did an episode a few months back on the invisible trades that we all make that none of us would choose, because sometimes these changes are not ones that are necessarily for the better, or they may be for the better of some of us, but the great detriment of others who also walk in their shadow. And a listener commented on Spotify underneath this episode saying that they'd like to see it as a series. I posited this to my patrons, and out of some 16 options, they voted for a follow-up episode on this as the strongest response. So here we are. If you are the listener that left that comment, thank you so much. And if you are one of the patrons that voted for it, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much that stuff means, so I won't. But if you do want to support the show, then please head on over to patreon.com/Endry. Try to get these out weekly. I apologize to everybody that has been a few weeks. As anyone who has or has had young kids knows, time just goes into a vortex and capability, well, it has to be flexible. So I thank you for your patience. But I hope it's well worth the wait, because I assure you that even though I'm not coming out each week, I'm spending all my time jotting down notes and thinking about how to make these episodes as good as possible for you. Because as you can see, all it takes is one comment requesting a bit more of something, and I'm happy to dedicate the next 20 hours of my life to whatever that tunnel might be. So welcome everyone to the Chris Endry podcast, and very shortly we'll be digging into some more of those invisible trades that we have all made but wouldn't choose. I have to start by saying thank you, Andy, no last name provided, for joining up as a casual tier on the Patreon. Great to have you on board, and I hope you enjoy this episode because it's going out to you. It's very hard when thinking about these not to fall into the pattern of sounding like an old person saying life used to be much better when I was young, especially when in talking about domains where I think that might be true. It's really tough because there's nothing kind of more predictable and useless than that sort of generational war and people assuming that whatever baseline conditions you grew up in are somehow superior than the conditions that people face at other times, because nothing is more constant than change and you can't step in the same river twice, etc., etc., etc. That being said, there's been an obvious distinct trend in the last decade, a couple decades, of the increasing commodification of things, and obviously the cyber revolutions that keep occurring and redefining how we live our lives in many of the absolute most important spheres that we do live, that are going to have a cost. And whilst the theme of today's episode does necessarily focus on those costs, I don't want to pretend that there aren't benefits. I do want to put a disclaimer that I'm very aware of all the benefits, but what I'm looking at ultimately is not, is there a good side to having a phone or whatever it is, but that sort of meta zoomed out. If we were aliens visiting our own planet for the first time and we were seeing what was happening and choosing to insert ourselves at a particular point in history and to make certain choices, would we, with full information knowing the consequences, make the same choice again? With phones, I think it's probably a yes. With computers, it's a yes. With medicine, it's a yes. Like all these big things. But there are so many different ways that we can go about how we take these technologies into our lives and how we sleepwalk into baselining them as the norms that we reify in our society, that if we got the chance to do it over again, I think barely would warrant a bit of reflection and adjustment. And one of these ones is a topic that you surprisingly seldom hear about, considering how sweeping and impactful it is and how radically different it is from just a couple of decades ago, and that is privacy. Somewhere along the line, we went from being very aware and concerned about the coming loss of privacy to just kind of holus bolus accepting it. And then now I would say not even really questioning it too much. Because the conception of what privacy means has had to radically change in the last couple of decades. Because 50 years ago, if one corporation wanted to know your location all of the time, they'd need to send someone to follow you, and they'd need to take photographs, and they'd need to, whatever. It would be resource intensive, and it would be odd, and it would feel creepy. Whereas now the cost of that is functionally zero, and it's also something that everybody does, which softens the extremity of it because, well, if everybody else is accepting this, then I should too. But I think the way that we've waded into the ocean of evaporating all of our individual privacy is something that happened without people's consent broadly. And it's also kind of irreversible. If you want to live a modern life, you kind of can't hope to live free of any digital footprint. And then all the digital services do set a significant record on the world around you, which can be traced for anything from fairly benign to extremely malicious purposes. And it's something that we bemoan casually now and then, but it's not something that I've seen a serious social level conversation about for quite some time. I remember when I studied at ANU, I did strategic studies in 2004 or something. And in that class, we learned about a government project called Echelon. And I think it was the Five Eyes network. So Australia, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and the US, who had this international system of satellites and whatever else monitoring all of the telephone and email communication that was occurring between people on the planet so that it could all be filtered and captured for identifying security risks. And at that time, it was a journalist from New Zealand who had just wandered into a not particularly secured satellite site and just broken into some filing cabinets and found like barely redacted documents that had just had sort of texter lines on them so they could still read what was occurring. And they were able to deduce what was occurring from that. And it was acknowledged subsequently by some of the governments, but not all of them. And there were identified instances of this spying being used not for seeing if somebody's going to commit an act of terrorism by attacking a major public site or whatever. But there were instances of the allies spying on each other. For example, I think the US were spying on a Canadian trade ambassador ahead of a wheat deal or something like that. And there was not too much public fallout from this. So little at the time that I remember talking to my friends about it, and they thought that it was a crazy conspiracy theory and didn't believe me that this Echelon project and I think the subsequent PRISM would exist. Fast forward 10 years or so, and you've got Edward Snowden leaking the total degree to which states are clearly spying on all citizens all the time by capturing 100% of our correspondence without warrants and without consent. And it caused an outrage, but it didn't cause a social shift in the sense that there's any commitment from governments not to do that. And I guess in the face of a kind of radical helplessness, instead everybody just sort of accepts it now. And not just accepts it, but willingly participates. I mean, I willingly participate. I hate the idea that all of my conversations, photos, browsing, reading, like purchases, whatever, are all just available for anybody to look at if they're from the sufficiently powerful body, like a major tech company or a government. Or the dark web, where apparently you can purchase this stuff freely. I wouldn't know. I don't really understand that stuff. But what do I do about it? I don't change any of my behavior. I'm not using encrypted communications, nor do I necessarily believe the mainstream encrypted communications are actually safe. I don't know. Yeah, personally, I guess I'm extrapolating. Personally, I feel this sort of helplessness whenever I think about it idly. And then I imagine that that's something that we, if we think about it at all go through experiencing, because what are you going to do? Like never talk to your friends, never own a phone. Like, yeah, those are options, but they're pretty radical. And you look around, is everybody being arrested for sending texts? No, some people are, but not most of the people that you know, that's for sure. And so maybe it's okay. But it is a situation that we've all collectively sleepwalked, somnambulisted into. And I don't think that we would choose to do that. And I think that we would take convenience hits to avoid that being the case, especially when the conveniences are things like getting very well targeted ads at good times on Instagram or whatever. And now, the degree to which privacy doesn't exist for most of us, it would have been a wet dream for a dictator like Joseph Stalin or something like that. They couldn't have expended enough resources. 1 in 4 people in the USSR could be a spy, and they still wouldn't have a fraction of the data and potential coercive control that even benign states and corporations can have over their constituents and users now. And that stuff is only going to explode even further. You're already seeing facial recognition technology mapping who's going where in the public sphere. That's kind of at the level of your local police now, seemingly. So who knows what's predictive stuff is, Minority Report style technologies at the higher levels. And as we put more and more of our lives into the cyber realm, and as the technologies get more and more advanced, there are only going to be further step shifts in that. Who knows what Palantir does, for example? I've got absolutely no idea, but I know that they make a lot of money selling security products to governments. And what's more is they're also governments that we don't have electoral control. If you're an Australian citizen and your data is being swept up by the US, if there's a big scandal, you have no electoral recourse to represent your interests in that. I mean, that's been the case the whole time, but as it gets more and more advanced and serious, maybe there are different choices that we would like to make. I don't know. Again, personally, I just kind of lean into the helplessness of it, but I do think that those are trades that we wouldn't make in this way. And they may come back to bite us particularly badly, because it's all well and good to have all of your citizens registered and to understand everything about them and to know their star signs, dietary difficulties, interrelational problems, extramarital affairs, purchasing habits, etc., etc. When those things are being used for marketing purposes or are not being exploited by security agencies. But in the instance where things escalate in the world a couple of steps and you end up having a state or corporations that have an existential struggle or perceived existential struggle against the interests of many of their citizens, well, suddenly it's not so good to have a clear register of where everyone will be at a particular given time of day and how to blackmail them, or where do all the left-handers live and how do we round them up, etc., etc. I think that that's one that really nobody has chosen that we would want to reconsider if we got another crack. And another one kind of following up from that is just our international system of states generally. I think that it's pretty clear that where we see the worst conflicts in the world, they tend to be where states are mismapped to the people that live in them, or certain states want more out of something, or there's a competitive system where states will push on each other for more resources, or they'll want to enforce a social morality, or whatever it is. Those things tend to be what drives a religious or an ethnic or even we've seen economic or ideological point of view. And those things tend to be the drivers of most of the deaths and kinetic conflicts that we've seen in the last few centuries. And okay, it's all well and good to bemoan that and to say, well, it'd be great. Imagine there's no countries, no religion too, et cetera, et cetera. But these things some of them do exist for a reason, and that reason is because it serves a purpose. And for all the chaos, there is still quite a bit of stability that exists under these umbrellas. I just think that if we were to redraw how we conceive of our entire political planet, we would want to do it so that where there is competition, it is not incentivized to involve violent destruction. And instead, there's a kind of competition and sharing that has at its core premise that we are all of the same species. But even then, we're all the same species on a planet that's all life that we want to protect, so that we can optimize our exchanges, our competitions, our developments for mutual advancement. Maybe that sounds like a bit of a kumbaya idea, as though that could exist. But I think there's any number of examples through history where a powerful actor will be happy to retard the development of rivals just so that they can keep the extent of their advantage. And that's not good. Surely you would rather design a game so that both participants can mutually grow. This is something you saw recently with the Nord Stream explosion, which was almost certainly done by American or American-aligned actors, where they're happy to set back Germany, their ally, quite significantly, because it also sets back Russia, their enemy. And I just think that's the type of thing that if you're parents watching kids in the sandpit play games like that, where everyone was destroying all of their stuff, kind of no one wins. Like, the incentives to rule over rubble shouldn't exist. And we could do a better job of structuring that. I think to go into that fully, I would need to do another episode. Let me know if you're interested. As you know, I'm happy to. But for now, I'll just leave it at the idea that how we do our political divisions of the world is not best mapped to the reality that incentivizes maximizing harmony, maximally harnessing the best of our abilities, and minimizing suffering. We could broadly be doing a much better job. And there are a whole bunch of outgrowths from those systems that see the species take risks and open doors that are almost in nobody's interest. There might be the interest of a very small subset at particular times, but for the collective, they're big losses. And I actually recorded a full episode on this and didn't release it because it's almost too dark. I think I need to find a funner way of coming at it. I don't want to bash everybody into depression, but nuclear weapons is absolutely, I think, one of those Pandora's boxes. I'm quite warm on some of it because I'm not blind to the fact that I've lived all my life in peace in a way that there wouldn't have been many generation of men of my ancestors who haven't faced the specter of some sort of military activity because of the umbrella of nuclear weapons and the mutually assured destruction that the systems offer. But the depressing element that I don't think we would have chosen is how precarious that system is. Because I think it's a lot more precarious than most of us realize. I think we get a pretty strong survivorship bias where, because we haven't had a nuclear catastrophe yet, we assume that these things are sort of under control and that the systems are adequate. Where I think any sort of mild, mathematically minded interrogation of that collapses it pretty quickly and is almost too big to think about because of how scary the threat of the reality of this situation is. And that's why I didn't release the episode. Maybe I'll put it up for patrons. I don't know. Do you support the show to be even more alarmed? Probably not. But I only say that to give an awareness that if you think about the things in your life that are hard to fix or that break down regularly, they're usually things with moving parts. The more moving parts something has, the more likely it is that something's going to go wrong. So say your dishwasher or your washing machine, your car, your computer, your relationships, my goodness, your life, your brain, your social decisions, all that stuff. The more moving pieces something has, the more likely it is to break down. And so I think often we conceive of nuclear weapons as being something that America had, tested, used on Japan, then Russia had, then a couple other countries, and that's kind of it. But we've detonated thousands of nuclear weapons, and we're not done yet, seemingly. There are still many actors trying to get them. There are presumably actors outside of nation states trying to get them. And people don't have them for no reason. They have them because they want to have a credible threat of using them. And for a threat of using them to be credible, there needs to be some line, even if it's through a million keys and through a million doors and through a million good decision makers, there still has to be a line between their existence and their usage, a path that can be traveled. And where those paths inevitably involve human decision making, it just seems to me that at some point there'll be some failure of failsafe after failsafe after failsafe, and the consequence of that could be anything from as small as a suitcase nuke being detonated in a war zone to the launching of enough missiles by one major actor to prompt the all-out survival risk launch from another, and we wipe out a significant chunk of life on the planet and civilization as we know it. If you have worked in risk, you know that a common way of measuring risk is you look at the likelihood that something will happen, and then you look at its consequences. And it's a metric combination of the two of those that lets you know how worried you should be about something. Say, for example, it's very likely that if you open up, start scrolling on Instagram late at night, that you won't get as much sleep, but the consequences are pretty low, so you do it anyway. Or at the other end, almost all of us, the next time we get in a car, are not going to have a crash, but those of us who do will be really glad that every single one of us was made to wear a seatbelt at the time. That there exists at all a system with a line to human decision making that the consequence is the destruction of a large swathe of the planet is a choice that I think most of us wouldn't have waded into. And if we did make that choice, I imagine we would have hoped that it would have been under the auspices of some sort of global government or some sort of universal benevolent overlord system rather than the US presidency, the Russian president, the Chinese chairman, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the system we have in the world we live in. And again, I think it's because there's kind of nothing that you or I can do about it, that every time our mind brushes to it, just like with the privacy stuff, it gets put into the too hard basket. I mean, it rightly gets put into the too hard basket and we move on. But I think the reason I talk about this stuff in public platforms where it's appropriate to do so is because I think we at least owe it to ourselves to have the discourse and understand it so that we don't just accept the ongoing escalation of things. Because, I mean, even right now, the US president has talked about returning to nuclear testing. And at the same time, the British and French are talking about putting troops into situations where they could come into direct contact with Russian troops, and they're all nuclear armed states. And I think if there's just a greater baseline awareness of how precarious these systems are, like you might not know, there are nukes, I think, in Belgium, the Netherlands, Turkey, Germany, like that are active right now. You know, we're only 15 minutes away from them being launched should decisions be made. And I think having a greater awareness of that hopefully radiates back so that we don't get too inured to the idea that this is an optimal state or one in which we can be trigger happy running risks kicking around that machine because we do only need it to fail once, etc., etc. Moving on to a bit of a lighter one. I think the cyberization, is that a word? I don't know. I sometimes use words that aren't words on this show. Sorry. The cyberization of sex is one that, look, it's cool, but it's probably one that we wouldn't have chosen in the way that it's occurred. And I don't want to sound like a Luddite or purist, because I think, at one end of the spectrum, you've got a moral take, which is sex is something that exists for reproduction and should be enjoyed under specific cultural conditions that are framed not by you. And then at the other end, I think you've got do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. And I like, unsurprisingly, I don't think either of those are particularly useful positions. I think that we're still navigating the fullness of what having certain kinds of unlimited sexual stimulus means, the ethical questions of how that's done aside. And I guess as we have a growing collective awareness of our brains, how they work, how we respond to stimulus and how we respond to excitement with things, and then how that flattens out and how that redefines how you see things and what you seek, et cetera, and defines your behavior. I don't think that we would choose to have the volume of non-physical sexual experiences in the way that we do now, because I don't think anybody sees the fact that, like, when you look at the stats of how many young people are having no sex, and particularly young men will go a year without having sex. It's like 30-something% or something like that. I don't think that anyone sees that and thinks, oh, well, that's because they're having so many great sexual experiences online, so good for them. I think most of those who have had positive sexual experiences would wish for other people to have those as well. And it all just reminds me of that Norm Macdonald joke where he said, when I was a young man, I would never have thought that I would need my computer to whack off. Yeah, I just don't think that the way that that's encroached on our lives is something that most of us would choose for ourselves. And I think you see that in how parents wonder what to do for their kids in these realms. I know for myself that the journey of sexual exploration, doing it, learning so much about that stuff for the first time with another person, rather than having, I would say, pretty perverted maps of what that could or should be, was easily one of the best things that I got to do in life. And not to say that I'm the only person who knows how to live or whatever, but of course I would want that for everybody. And to know that people are being robbed of that for some very boring reasons that are not chosen is sad to me, and one to put on the list of things that I think we would reconsider if given the opportunity. And I should say, this episode and these themes are not just a tour of things that we can do nothing about, or a tour of horses that are bolted. I just think it's worth reflecting upon them so that you can have an assessment and realize it's not automatically the case that life, in the way that I experience it, has to be this way. Because as I said at the top, there are so many different lives and ways of seeing the world throughout history, and from society to society and individual to individual. Just taking a moment to reflect upon that now and then, it gives you the capacity to navigate, oh, well, what level do I want this to be at for myself? And to realize that you can actually change a lot of those levels. Another topic that I wanted to do a full episode on, and still made down the line, but maybe it's a bit tedious for me to talk about it because it's something that everyone's talking about in one way or another at the moment, is AI risk. At times when I'm reading about it, I start to worry genuinely that we've cooked it and that it's inevitable now, the countdown to reaching the point at which we're no longer the dominant form of intelligence on the planet, which could go really badly for us. There's any number of ways that could happen, and they're pretty interesting to imagine. It also might not happen, but just again on that risk metric, say if it's a 1 in 10 chance that we unleash a form of intelligence through all of our systems that is superior to us and able to undermine us and control us. Well, I mean, if you had a dice with 10 sides on it, and one of those sides resulted in the enslavement of you and everyone you know, would you roll the dice, or would you say, oh, let's just leave that dice in the box? I think the way in which we're going about AI is kind of analogous to that, especially when you have sort of the worst psychos rolling the dice. Because even the benevolent ones who are very aware of this, like Elon Musk, for example, is very aware of this risk. And that's why he's trying to do it, because he thinks by stewarding it in, he'll be able to offset the worst of it. You just don't know what you don't know with this stuff. And then in the same plane, you've got people like Sam Altman, who I'm sure would run me down in his car if it would get him to where he was going slightly quicker. Yeah, it really is a small, narrow subset of people that we have making all the decisions around this stuff at the moment. And, maybe that's just an inevitable nature of progress and the types of people that are attracted to the edges of achievement and all the potential riches that lie on the other side of that. Because just as easily, it could be a total fizzer, or it could be something that enriches our lives and makes us fantastically wealthy, whatever. But yes, given there is a non-zero risk of a disastrous outcome, some gains are perhaps not worth inviting the risk of, or at least having a framework in advance determined for how you undertake its development could be cool. I mean, it kind of harkens back to what I was saying about the international system of states, in that one common argument you hear for why we're not going to see a reduction in development is because if the Americans slow down in their advancements now, well, the Chinese will just do it instead. So you get this sort of mutual arms race of potentially doing something that you otherwise wouldn't. It's exactly the same with the nukes and any number of other potential things that you can imagine that don't at any point align with the question, what is going to make the best world imaginable for all of us? So perhaps not surprisingly, I've filled my dance card much quicker than I thought I would. I got many more topics that I want to talk about. So maybe there will be a third edition down the line. All it takes is one Spotify comment. But the last one I want to talk about today it's a theme that runs across these as well, which is the growing commodification of everything. There are so many things in our society that once we quantify them, put a number on them, put them into the market, try and trade them for profit, they change their shape but retain their noun. So I think in the last edition of this, I talked about how we make things that not only break, but we can't fix. I remember being shocked. There was an iron that I got from Kmart for $10 once and took it home, plugged it in. It didn't iron. Like, it's the basic function. It didn't do it. It didn't do its only function. And I realized, its job is not to iron. Its job is to look like an iron that someone will buy and take home. Like, I wasn't going to return it for $10. The whole chain of production was doing its job, except for at the end of it, I was hoping to have a less crinkled shirt, and I was not able to do that. So even though it's called an iron, it looks like an iron, generates GDP, and it uses these resources, and people getting paid for marketing, people getting paid for the extraction of the metal, whatever, it all looks like it works. It's actually a pretty shit idea because an iron is not an iron. And you could say that for kind of any product. But the one I wanted to look at is healthcare products, because healthcare is pretty important. It's something that almost everybody's going to intersect with, often significantly throughout our lives. And you want it to be as good as possible. But even in places like Europe, where I live, or Australia, where I grew up, that are winning relative to America, where everything is commodified and the extremes are obvious, so we can all sit on high chairs and look down and think that they're dumb. But even how we do these things is kind of insane. Because if you were to line up, say, the 100 people that live on my street across their entire life and say, what's the optimal way for you to use your body so that you have a good operating muscular system, you would never say, oh, just do whatever you want. And then at some point, something might become particularly bad. And if it becomes so bad that you decide to pay for help, you can go see a physio and get some treatment. Because that's just dealing with one particular thing at one particular point. And it doesn't at all align with what your optimal incentive would be, which is to make sure that those 100 people can use their bodies as much as they wish. And any issues that they have with their bodies are ones that they're able to address themselves as much as possible. And I'm not even bringing into the picture yet the fact that every physio you see will give you a set of exercises that they know that only 2% of the people that go away are actually doing. It's kind of a bit backwards. I just picked muscles and physio, but you could pick any. I mean, if you're going to have heart issues, you're potentially and even likely doing behaviors that are going to lead to your heart issues 20, 30, 40 years before you experience them. And gee, wouldn't it be nicer to have an awareness or an incentive to deal with them early, so that the next and first stage of intervention is, I have a big heart problem and I need to receive an invasive surgery to address it, or consume a disruptive drug, or whatever it might be. And this is a known problem in health for the people that are responsible for dealing with it, which is mostly states. And that's why you see programs like, eat well, exercise, and whatever. But those things ultimately attract a lot less funding and are a lot less popular politically than hospital beds, cheaper medicines, whatever it might be. Whereas it might be optimal in the future, and you might see this in some societies, for your government to give you $20 to walk to work instead of driving. Or actually, this is something I saw in Cluj in Transylvania. You could get a free bus ticket if you did 10 squats in front of a machine before jumping on. These things aren't necessarily equitable. And, what about the people that can't do them, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what else is inequitable? Money. People have totally different capacities to earn money, and people have totally different amounts of money. So I think that there are much better ways that we could manage what has been the creeping commodification. And I'm frustrating myself here because there's probably 1,000 things that I want to talk about just in this specific topic, particularly around my experience of maternity care and childbirth. Like, there are so many interchangeable things. So, say, for example, when we had our baby who was born in Australia, we saw, I think, 7 midwives in the first 2 weeks. And here we were able to see just the one the whole time. And the difference is kind of as significant as going on 7 dates with 7 different people, or 7 dates with the one person, in terms of how well you get to know a situation. But they're both chalked up as the same level of care in a way, because a nurse is a nurse and an appointment is an appointment. And in the same way, if you live in a small town where you have the same doctor that you see all the time, Whereas where I lived in Canberra, I don't think I ever saw the same doctor twice across maybe 10 years. The level of care is totally different. And furthermore, even separate to the unitary stuff, if you're seeing a doctor that you also run into at the supermarket or you see them at the football game or whatever, then there are social ties that mean that if you go in there with a problem, they know they're going to see you again, or they know who you are. Maybe there's an extra level of incentive for them to have a particular care or to be able to find solutions or to see that you're struggling outside of just the appointment situation or whatever it might be, or feel a responsibility to the care of the community rather than just the individual units that appear in front of them. This stuff is, I think, so obvious and known within the realms, but you don't see adequate solutions to this at the policy level in most instances. And I'm sure that if you are listening to this and you work in health policy, you're screaming, yes, that's extremely obvious. We all know that. Yet we aren't seeing the results. I'm not saying that I know everything and have all the answers. I'm saying that we have walked into this situation where we've commodified healthcare in a way that is ultimately not serving us. And it's, sorry to go woo-woo, but there's a certain spirit to things that is lost when they're commodified, when they're done as business transactions rather than in community. Say, for example, if you're sick and your grandma brings you a soup, that soup is going to be better than one that the Deliveroo driver brings. Just inevitably. And there's a few obvious reasons why that's the case. But I imagine that most of us in our modern life are further from being able to get that soup from our grandmother, which would have been a right for everybody a century ago, than we are to hitting the button and getting that soup from Deliveroo. And the same is the case for childcare. You're probably happier leaving your kids with your aunts for the day, but we're further away from doing that than we are from spending 30 grand a year to have them with some strangers who are in for-profit business models, full of ironically underpaid staff who are just not going to be, it's not a like-for-like replacement. Doing a big gardening bee where you get all your friends over to work on each other's gardens and then have a big lunch and some beers at the end of the day is a more satisfying experience than paying some ex-crooks from Jim's Mowing $250 to come and do a half-assed job of your yard. But again, we're much closer to the latter than we are the former. And you can run this metric across kind of everything. And at scale, it's not only that these unitary things are treated indifferently or at equivalence, but it's even worse because you getting all your friends over to dig around your yard and to make it really nice so that you can have a good spot to live is something that they're all going to care about. But also it doesn't generate any GDP. It doesn't generate any money. Doesn't generate any tax. Whereas you get the Jim's Mowers guys over to do it. They don't know you. They're not incentivized to care for the small details, and they're not going to hang around and have a nice meal at the end. But they do generate GDP. They do generate tax. And so therefore, for policymakers, it looks like that's a more functioning society than the one where it's just the friends coming around and doing it. So this kind of commodification and unitary measurement of things, it can seem innocuous and it can seem useful as though you're getting a grasp of reality, but it is actually pushing good realities away. And I think across the board, there's any number of such trades that we all inadvertently make because they're convenient and because they're increasingly culturally the norm, but none of us would choose if we were to design our ideal society, which we collectively do get to do. So that's, I guess, the last thing I would want to say. We do get to collectively over all of these things, any of them you can imagine that you encounter. Next time you get the chance, vote with your feet, call up your group of friends and say, hey, working bee, we'll do it. It's going to be on this day. Or next time you can push in, if you want to have a childcare situation, set up a roster where you're sharing with your friends, whatever it might be. Push past the inertia of the convenience models and find the friction because the experience is on the other side of them. It's not like they're slightly better. Sometimes they're infinitely better. And sometimes they can define your whole life in a positive way. Little pep talk from me to end the episode. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that this was what you had in mind when you voted for another episode on the invisible trades we've all made but would not choose. As threatened, I have many, many more topics upon this, but there were other strong contenders from the Patreon poll. If you haven't voted, head on over to patreon.com/Andrew. You can join at a free tier and vote for what you want to see me talking about in these episodes next. All right. Thanks again for your patience, and I hope to be back with you again next week. Please take care of yourselves and each other. No nuclear war. Bye.